Thank you. Assemblyman Greenwald moves the bill. Assemblyman Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill.
On the bill.
Mr. Speaker, the question presented today is whether we, as a body, will substitute one completely arbitrary limit for a smaller and even more arbitrary limit on magazine size, instantly turning millions of our fellow citizens, law-abiding New Jersey residents, into second-degree criminals. For the offense, Mr. Speaker, of possessing a metal box with a spring, including magazines for the most commonly owned handguns, this body intends to treat otherwise law-abiding citizens the same way it treats sex offenders, aggravated arsonists, burglars, and kidnappers. For the offense of peaceably owning an utterly harmless item, we will throw these peaceful citizens into jail for up to 10 years, at a cost to the public of up to $80,000 per annum, fine them up to $150,000, and utterly destroy their lives. And for what? A public relations stunt. Because that, Mr. Speaker, is what this bill is all about. It will do precisely nothing to save a single life, but will ruin numerous other lives, all the while impinging on basic fundamental constitutional rights, all that some folks can say that they are doing something. Whenever this subject comes up, Mr. Speaker, logic, never mind common sense, goes right out the window. Let's start with simple logic. If the number of bullets we permit in a magazine is measured by the number of dead children we're willing to accept, the only even remotely moral number is 0. That, presumably, is what led some of our Democratic colleagues in the other House to intone confiscate, confiscate, confiscate. When someone avers that the reason for adopting this particular arbitrary limit is that a mass killing perpetrated by a nutcase, a child was killed with the 11th round, one has to ask, what about the child killed with the 9th? Fortunately, Assemblyman Cryan has a bill ready in the wings to limit magazine sizes down to 5. But then, what about the child killed with the 4th bullet? The simple fact is that any arbitrary limit does nothing to save lives, but simply turns huge numbers of our neighbors into criminals. Now let's talk about common sense, Mr. Speaker. We do not measure our freedoms against the possibility that a lunatic, psychopath, or basely evil criminal will abuse them. A free society asks not why people want or need their freedom. It asks why government would restrict it. On a more banal level, we do not limit alcohol sales to 2 shots because some of them might lead to a DWI. We do not consider someone possessing a 6-pack as wielding assault beer, nor ask why another would actually need to buy a gallon or a keg of wine or beer. We do not ban cars to prevent speeding, nor insist that they come standard with ignition interlocks to ensure against drunk driving. We do not limit possession of swimming pools to licensed lifeguards, despite the fact that children are substantially more likely to die by drowning than by gunshot, let alone by mass murder. And none of these items, Mr. Speaker, booze, cars, pools, are endowed with constitutional protections. Presumably, we could severely regulate, if not outright ban them, and all within our authority as legislators. But, for the most part, we don't, despite the fact that they are much more deadly than firearms, let alone those in the hands of law-abiding citizens. And why not? Because we understand that their utility outweighs the dangers. But apparently, a segment of our population simply doesn't like guns, doesn't trust the people, but does trust the government. In this, they have their priorities absolutely backwards. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we see the hypocrisy in this segment of the bill, which expressly permits former police officers to carry 15-round magazines. Why? What makes a former cop any more vulnerable or any more trustworthy than his neighbor? In an infamous case of assault by popcorn in Texas, which produced a tragic killing, the shooter was a retired cop. There's precisely no reason to trust former governmental employees with instrumentalities which would land his neighbor in jail for up to a decade. Mr. Speaker, again, we are speaking here of a metal box with a spring, which any child can lawfully possess by simply moving 500 yards across the Delaware to a state which takes its freedom more seriously while valuing the lives of its children no less, because they know a silly proposal when they see one. Mr. Speaker, if this proposal is adopted, not dozens, not hundreds, but many thousands, if not millions of people whose only offense is to own the wrong size metal box will be potentially ensnared in the criminal justice system, face long, sometimes mandatory sentences, and have their lives destroyed. And for what? There is quite literally no benefit to public safety from a proposal such as this. It will not save one life while potentially ruining tens of thousands. It represents not just bad policy, but not even profoundly silly policy, but absurd and unconstitutional policy. Mr. Speaker, this bill represents the latest in a long line of anti-freedom proposals which do nothing to advance public safety, but greatly impinge upon the rights of the people. While there is certainly room for improvement in the criminal justice system, and room for improvement in our method of identifying those in need of mental health services and ensuring that they receive it, there should be absolutely no room for restricting rights and freedoms and ruining the lives of law-abiding citizens whose only offense is running afoul of a public relations gesture. If the law instantly turns millions of citizens who have never even thought about committing a crime into the equivalent of sex offenders, it's almost certainly a really bad idea. Policy, Mr. Speaker, especially that touching the most cherished rights of Americans, ought to be calmly, rationally, and dispassionately made. It's no more rational to blame a firearm when a criminal or lunatic misuses it than it is to blame Heineken or Ford for a DWI. Punishing the guilty and helping the mentally imbalanced to ensure that they do not become a danger to themselves or others is well within the prerogative of this body. But depriving millions of people of their cherished rights because an infinitesimally small number of our fellow citizens abuse those constitutionally guaranteed liberties is unwise, improper, and unconstitutional. This proposal is not a reasonable measure to save lives, but it does have huge consequences upon personal freedom. It will stop no criminals and will create thousands of new ones. It will work hardships upon millions of our fellow citizens, those people we purport to represent. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, I urge a negative vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman.